Hello, my name's Simon Atkinson. In this brief presentation, I want to approach two of the initial learning designs which we discussed previously, that of stimulus and narrative. I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these in the context of this QIA project. I've already introduced to you the Dialy framework that Kevin Burden and I have been developing, which looks at the learning spaces and the context in which learning takes place, and then presents a range of possible learning designs for the deployment of digital resources. And I'm going to talk specifically about two of these as they've evolved in the work so far, and doubtless there will be some further development. The first of these is stimulus, and this is a recognition that an awful lot of the learning that takes place in our institutions is in what we might call traditional class context, in which there is delivery taking place. And it's often difficult for us to get students to think front and center, to focus, to become engaged right from the outset of a particular presentation, and to sustain that interest. So there's some various classroom management aspects of this project which we've taken into account. So the first of our categories is, in a sense, addresses that and deals simply with the notion that some of these resources provide a stimulus for learning. And we've divided that into initially these four categories. The starter plenary is exactly as it sounds and is relatively obvious. One may actually play a sound or visual clip or leave a dramatic image up displayed at the outset, so that as students arrive in the learning space, they are aware of a context that's being set for them. And the image or the sound or the video that's being played need not necessarily address directly the subject content that's going to be discussed during the course of that learning engagement. It may be deliberately tangential, so as to engage learners in some thought process that attempts to match what it is they think they're going to be learning in the course of that session and what actually is taking place. It is important, of course, that students themselves are clear about what it is the purpose of that learning engagement is, and so it would depend a little bit on how one is delivering clearly to students the nature of the learning session, delivering to them the intended learning outcomes for the session, and so on, the extent to which one would want to work against that in terms of stimulus. But nonetheless, this notion that students would arrive in a learning space already stimulated to hear what it is you have to say and to engage in the activities that you've prepared for them. The second of these, which is an extension, is topping and tailing, and this is simply a suggestion about how one might evolve on this earlier notion of the starter or plenary session, which is to say that a lot of these clips are very, very malleable. It is permissible within some of the licenses to make alterations, to change the display, to change the configuration, and therefore you have the opportunity to play a video clip without sound, for instance, simply obviously by muting it, but you might also actually edit the sound. You could display a clip, an obscure visual clip, an image from an archive, and obscure part of that image. So you can manipulate the images. And one of the patterns which we've found to be really quite interesting is this notion that you would top a session and tail a session and provide some structure through the digital artifacts themselves. So to perhaps show a clip at the beginning without the sound, deliver the learning, and then play it again at the end of the session with the sound is a way of getting students to bridge that gap and recognize how far they've come. Are they listening then to a commentary which they recognize? Is it what they expected to hear, given what they've then learnt during the session? If they're looking at an image and there is a missing illustration to a news story, for instance, from a news archive, and then they see the picture displayed above, does the picture meet their expectations, having been through this particular learning session? So the idea that you can take some of the artifacts and manipulate them in ways which actually heightens the expectation of students is a way of heightening their engagement as well. The third one is an extension of that, which is to manage that expectation in terms of the dissonance and shock. Again, this depends a little bit on the nature of the group and the nature of the learning space. But where you might expect there to be some dissent within a group and you're confident that that is manageable, some of the resources available do produce, or possibly could be seen as producing, some disagreement, some dissonance within a cohort of learners, and that, if managed, could be actually a great stimulus to learning, to put up an illustration for display and ask for consideration of it when you know that the reactions will be very mixed in an audience, could create an interesting situation. Now, it may be that one would choose to do this towards the end, or indeed as the conclusion to a session, so that any dissonance didn't have to be managed within the confines of the learning space, but would provide a huge stimulus then for the following session. We've used the term shock, but clearly there are huge ethical issues which need to be discussed and debated. But shock is also something which is worth considering. There will be artifacts within these resources which are very surprising and perhaps defy expectations, and it's well worth considering whether those could be deployed. Some of the materials will have that immediate effect. Others will actually require a great deal of attention. And the fourth element within stimulus is this notion of what we've called observational category. Sometimes this is as simple as saying what happened next. In the case certainly of video archives, it's to show things and say what happened next. But there's also the detailed reading of a text. There's the detailed study of an archive image. And the detailed attention, the detailed listening to an audio clip. So it applies to all of the various resources that are available. Sometimes there are contradictions in those texts, be they audio or visual texts, and there are elements within them that require very detailed analysis. And so to set up a session, particularly perhaps again at the conclusion of a session, to say, here is something which requires a great deal of detailed thought and reflection, because there is something in this which will be a stimulus to further learning in subsequent sessions. So those are four of the areas we've described in terms of stimulus. The second learning design we've called storytelling. I'll deal with this very briefly. It's perhaps in some respects the most obvious. It is true that all the media which we've described, in some senses or another, tell a story, and the recognition by learners that a story is being told then of course raises interesting issues about who is telling the story, for what purpose, what their motivations might be. And this will be true as much of a 19th century newspaper article as it is of a 1960s television news story. The recognition that materials are sequenced in a particular way, that they're positioned in a particular context, be it a news story on a page or a video clip that's actually being played as part of a news coverage program, is also a recognition that context is all important in delivering the message. And so one might ask students to consider how a story might finish, simply cutting off the end of the story and getting them to engage in whether the process of the story is as evident as one might appear, or in a more detailed sense, one might actually ask students to consider whether or not the story itself has more substance to it, and the notion of getting students to complete the backstory. It's important to note that we're not talking here about developing media literacy skills or the textual analysis skills, video textual analysis skills. Those will be dealt with in another part of the framework. So those are 2 of the 10 designs, and we'll deal with the others in subsequent weeks.